Now we're going to go section by section through the Inputs tab itself. We won't go into detail of every single cell, but I do want to provide an overview of how to complete the checklist. And we're also going to touch on areas that have updated since the last version of the checklist. So first of all, at the top of the tab, you'll see a couple of sections, sort of headers, that give a little bit of context and background to the checklist itself. Most of these things we've already gone through in this presentation. So the applicability of the checklist, the fact that it's for STEPCO projects under BCBC 2018 revision 5 is sort of the first piece. And then the second piece has a few more user tips that, again, we've already really touched on in this presentation. Section A is where you enter information about the project. So most of these fields are really self-explanatory, the name, the address, the location, etc. But we still have provided a lot of notes and tips in there if you need them. A couple of things to note that have changed from the previous version include the building permit date. So this is intended to be the date that the building permit is set for the project, and you can enter the exact date if that's known, and then it'll populate the applicable BCBC version. Of course, it's recognized that oftentimes, especially when you're submitting for a permit, the actual date isn't known yet, so you can leave that blank and just put in the version of the BCBC yourself. Another change is that the total model floor area is now calculated from areas entered elsewhere in the checklist, so you don't have to do it more than once. And finally, when you choose a selection from the drop-down menu, now it's going to populate heating degree days, or HDD, and the climate zone, unless you're in one of the jurisdictions that doesn't have HDD as noted in the building code. And in that case, you're going to get blank results. Either way, you can override those entries yourself. So if you're working in a jurisdiction that has their own requirements for heating degree days or others or the climate zone, you can just override that yourself, and that shouldn't be an issue. Section B is building information and performance requirements for buildings with a baseline or a reference. So as in the last version of the checklist, what you do is you start by selecting the appropriate major occupancy classification from the drop-down menu. You assign the model floor area associated with that classification, and then use the drop-down to identify the performance requirement. So you'll see that step 1 is no longer available here since that's not in the step code anymore. If your jurisdiction had a % better requirement, then you enter that information in here. And then there's an option to identify what is the source of this performance requirement. So for example, if you're working somewhere that has a policy or a bylaw specifying one of these options, then that's what you would identify here. And you continue down entering this information for all relevant major occupancy classifications in your building, and the total floor area will get added up at that point. Then you identify information basically how the baseline or reference energy model is performing. So you put in the total annual thermal energy demand in kilowatt hours, and that's going to come up or populate with the TEDI for the baseline building. Then you enter the annual energy based on fuel type for the baseline building, and that will populate the TUI. And you'll notice that you enter the annual energy based on the fuel type, which has got an emissions factor associated with it. So as that's being entered, the emissions GHGI for the baseline building will also be calculated at the same time. So once you've completed this section, then we'll have the baseline performance for the reference building. Now, section C is quite similar to section B. It's just that it's for step code occupancies, basically ones that have intensity limits. So once again, you start by using the drop-down menu to select the occupancy classification. And then you enter the model floor area and if there's a step or a GHG emissions level required. Again, you can enter the source of that requirement if relevant. And by filling out that row, it's going to calculate the TUI, TEDI, and GHGI requirement or limits for that area in the building. Once again, you keep going and entering more spaces as required, and it's going to calculate the total model floor area and area weighted totals for the step code portion of the building. Oh, one note is that the GHGI you'll see is hashed, meaning that it can be overridden if you need to. Section D summarizes information from B and C to generate whole building energy limits, or sorry, whole building step code limits. So the 2E, the TEDI, and the GHGI. There's no user entry required. It's just going to take those results that we saw in the two previous ones and area weight them together. And this is where we wanted to point out that the MFA in Section A is also going to get populated at this time based on sections B and C. So now that we've identified the performance requirements that the building has to meet, Section E is where we put in the model results to explain how the energy model, how the project is performing. So we start with a very similar, this doesn't change from the previous version. You're asked to identify the annual energy per end use and fuel types. And you can see that there's a number of standard end uses provided, but there's also the option to enter your own ones if you have some that aren't listed here, or if in some cases you may have one of these that uses multiple fuels, then you can use one of the rows to separate out those fuel types. If these extra 3 rows aren't enough, then you can expand the spreadsheet further and get more rows in there as well. So this top section will calculate the TUI and the GHGI result because the emissions factors are added in here. So at the bottom here is where we enter information for TEDI and SEDI. So here's where we enter the annual thermal energy demand for TEDI for the whole building. And here's where we enter it for the step code building portions only. So those are the ones that we outlined in section C earlier on the checklist. Now, if you have any information entered in the cooling energy result, then this cell will also turn yellow, meaning that you have to enter information for the annual cooling energy demand for SEDI. The next section is the emissions factor and renewable energy, and so this has been updated to reflect the zero carbon step code. So firstly, electricity and natural gas emissions factors have been set based on BCBC. And then there's 4 user entry options, 1 for district energy, and then 3 others for whatever fuel type may be present on your site. Now, the way that you enter those is you provide the fuel name or just other descriptors. So in this case, we've entered in the district energy line. And then you enter the emissions factor and provide the source of where that emissions factor is coming from. So it may be actual district energy system operation if you're working with DES, or perhaps an AHJ bylaw or policy that explains how this should be treated in their locale. And you do the same thing for any other fuel types. They also have the descriptor, the emissions factor, and the source that you need to enter. One of the things that's noted really clearly in the checklist itself in some of those notes is that anywhere you're using other fuel types, they need to be secured to the satisfaction of the jurisdiction. The next section that we've added is for when the makeup air unit pressurizing a corridor in a residential building uses multiple fuels. So this is really unique to that circumstance of residential buildings with corridor pressurization. And the reason it was important is that some buildings were using 1 fuel type, some had multiple, and that would actually affect how the corridor adjustment calculation is being performed. So what you can do is enter up to 3 fuel types using the drop-down menu, and that's going to give you the options of whatever is listed here. The emissions factor will be populated, and then you enter in the percent of annual load, and that will update the corridor adjustment accordingly. Now, if your building is, for example, an office and doesn't have this unique circumstance, you can just hit the minus button and hide this section, and it won't be part of your checklist at all. And finally, this section here is for on-site generated renewable electricity. So all you have to do is enter in the kilowatt hours generated into that yellow cell, and it will calculate an adjusted electricity emissions factor, which is based on the City of Vancouver energy modeling guidelines. There's a calculation in there that that explains what the calculation is. Continuing down section E, there's a few more requirements that are specialized to certain buildings. So overheating is if you have spaces that are non-mechanically cooled. Usually this is again in residential buildings. This section hasn't changed since the previous version. And if you need information on the details of those inputs, do check out the user guide. And then this section is also for residential projects. This is where you enter information to calculate the corridor pressurization adjustment. Just a tip, one of the things that we see a lot, make sure that you're entering the correct area of corridors, only the ones that are being pressurized by the makeup air unit. So if you have other corridors in the building, then don't account for those. And they also have to be corridors that attach to adjacent dwelling units. So if you have a 10-story building, for example, but the lower story is just lobby and amenity space, and the same makeup air unit is serving that lobby and corridor, then exclude the corridor area from that level. And then here's where you identify the makeup air fuel mixture that we were just talking about in the previous section, if that's relevant to your project. Finally, the suite submetering adjustment is for if you have hydronic heating in your residential project. So you identify whether yes or no it is submetered or not. Once all of the inputs have been completed, then we look at the results. So this blue section is the whole building results, and this green is for if you have a mixed use building, it's for step code portions only. So what you'll see is that, first of all, the requirements are copied down from section D, and then the results as modeled are populated in this row. The next two rows account for the corridor pressurization and suite submetering adjustment, if those are relevant to your building. If not, they'll just remain 0 or blank. And then the adjusted whole building performance for compliance is what is compared against the requirements, and you'll get either a green yes or a red no, depending on whether the results comply with that first row. And then the same process is used for the step code TEDI requirement for the step code portions of the building only in the case of mixed use occupancies. So this will be relevant only to spaces listed in section C of the checklist. Section F is used to summarize several of the building's key characteristics that relate to energy. So the intent of this section is for authorities having jurisdiction to check some of the reasonableness of the inputs as they relate to the results. And also, I've mentioned before how some jurisdictions are data mining these checklists so that they can use that information to inform future policy. So this is a part of that, helping to better understand how step code buildings are being built in BC. At the top, users are asked to identify the software used and the simulation weather file. And as a tip, we recommend not putting in something as simple as Vancouver, because Vancouver has a lot of different weather files available. Think of identifying being a more specific location and also including potentially the year, because now there's a lot of future weather files that are often in use as well. The next section is something new to the latest version of the checklist, where users are being asked to identify the architectural, mechanical, and electrical drawing sets upon which the model was based. So for anyone from a jurisdiction who's reviewing these checklists and also reviewing perhaps permit submissions at the same time, this means that they just have a double check that the information that was used in the model is also the same as what they're getting as part of the rest of the permit submission. There are also a couple of other line items here. So things like perhaps envelope reports or other reports that may relate to the energy side of things could also be noted in those line items. And then this section refers to several building characteristics. Many are envelope related. Basically, just some of the key set code items that are being asked for so that the jurisdiction can review them again in comparison to the results. And then finally, this portion here has been updated a fair amount. It has to do with the mechanical systems. So there's a section for heating systems, cooling systems, and domestic hot water. And each of them has a drop-down menu for plant and system types, and then a description section. So a couple of notes, the drop-down menus have been updated to align a little bit more with the Vancouver forms, but you'll notice they're not that extensive. So if you're completing this checklist and you can't find something that matches exactly your system, you have the option to just choose the best one, the closest match, or you can put in other and then provide information in the description box. And in fact, we kind of encourage everybody to just use the description box as much as you can to try to describe what's going on with the building. And finally, section G is for contact information. It's pretty straightforward. The idea, though, is that it should be the person who's completed the form, whose name is going on there. So that may be the person who also provided the energy model. That often happens. But in the case that the energy modeler provided a report, which was later used to inform this checklist, then whoever was the one completing the checklist is the one whose name should go in here.